Hey everybody, this is John for MTG Nexus with our prelim report for the week of January 7th. This covers everything from January 1st through January 7th, modern prelims. Once again, this is the prelims only, so this excludes any type of challenge events, any type of other modern championships, any other paper events. This is just strictly tracking basically the Magic Online pre-PTQ format where you get 40 qualifier points if you go 4-1 or better. And these lists have all gone 3-2 or better in events where people are putting 30 ticks in. So these tend to be events that people place a lot of faith in their deck when they're playing them. So last week when we went over the overall summaries, just a quick refresher, the basic thing is Urza Oko was about 20% of the field, and then Eldrazi Tron and Death Shadow both had about a little over 10% of the field. In contrast this week, one of the big things is outside of Bant Snow, there really wasn't any other deck that approached 10% other than Burn. So the field was a lot more 1s and 2s this week, other than obviously Urza Oko kind of being the default tier 0 deck in these more high pressure events. So something to note there. And the Bant Snow variants kind of break down into two variants, so they're broke down into the Bant Snowblade and the Bant Snow Control. Basically, the main difference between the two is whether they're playing more controlling elements or if they're playing a Stoneforge Mystic package. Beyond that, the field, you've still got E-Tron, Titan, the Titan field decks that have been popping up. Another deck that's been popping up is Slivers, and that's all been one person, Burke over on the Burn Discord. Familiar with his decks, kind of funny there. But beyond that, we've had a lot of decks performing well. Crabvine and Dredge both been popping up in some decent numbers. There was a Ponza deck, some other stuff down here. Like I said, a lot of one-ofs, a lot of interesting decks are popping up. So under the surface of this Urza Oko domination, I think the format is actually doing quite well. But unfortunately, this deck is definitely dominating the format. And if you'd like to see more of how this deck plays out, you can feel free to check out the playlist, which will be listed above, my attempts to play this deck so far in this week. With that said, let's hop into a couple of deck lists that I found interesting, and I hope you will too, in the next couple of slides. So the first deck that I found interesting was the Bant Snowblade deck that I mentioned in the summary. Basically, the main thing is this deck is running things like Spell Queller and Stoneforge Mystic, as opposed to a more controlling package, using Force of Negation to protect your 2 tap-out threats of Stoneforge Mystic and Oko, Thief of Crowns. This deck is a little bit more aggressively slanted. It's just basically either slam Stoneforge or Oko onto and then kind of protect it for a turn or two, kind of let it take over the game from there. To that end, you have Batterskull and Sword of Feast and Famine in the main deck. No other additional equipment in this particular sideboard, but obviously you could run other equipment. Notable is the snow package with Icefang, Coatl, Arcum's Astrolabe, and some snow-covered lands here. This gives you some additional removal against some of the more aggressive decks in the format. Allows you to like flash and surprise blockers for things like Tarmogoyf and such. And then it kind of supplements Path to Exile. Once upon a time, help kind of tie the land base together, as well as help you find, your copies of Stoneforge Mystic. A little bit less exciting if you find a Spell Queller, because your opponent knows it's there. But even then, playing around Spell Queller can serve its own purpose. And then obviously the sideboard, greatest hits of 2019, Veil of Summer, Mystic Dispute, Teferi Time Raveler, and then obviously things like Supreme Verdict and Return to Nature here kind of serve different purposes. Return to Nature is kind of a nice flexible card. I think this card is kind of underplayed. It is a little bit expensive for its effect. It's a disenchant with upside. You can exile a card from the graveyard, so it can serve a purpose much like a Rest in Peace Surgical Extraction kind of, well, not Surgical Extraction, but like a targeted effect, which can be nice. And then kind of serves a dual purpose, something like Ashiok does in a lot of decks. Ashiok the Dreamweaver, allowing you to have a more flexible sideboard a little bit. And then Veil of Summer, obviously this is important in a bunch of counterspell mirrors, not just against blue-white X control, but also against the Urza Oko decks that are packing it. Counterspells, especially the non-Doctor Sword version of the deck. Let's get on to an interesting take on Eldrazi Tron. One of the things when going against Eldrazi Tron that, as a burn player, at points that I've been able to exploit is the lack of consistency in the deck. So this deck is, in some ways, a kind of amalgamation of the Field of the Dead and Eldrazi Tron decks. Obviously, it's not Tron per se, but it's kind of like, I don't know, kind of like the Eldrazi ramp decks in Pioneer without Field of the Dead, and it's leveraging the ability to cast Primeval Titan, but also backs up with things like Thought-Knot Seer, World Breaker, Ulamog. So you have a little bit more flexibility at your top end here. Ability to disrupt your opponent in the mirror match, blowing up their lands, setting them behind. Thought-Knot Seer to kind of take a key combo piece if you're able to land an early Eldrazi Temple or Arboreal Grazer, that kind of stuff. And then Once Upon a Time and Ancient Stirrings kind of hold it all together. Like literally, Ancient Stirrings can find everything but Arboreal Grazer and Sakura Tribe Builder and your other spells here. So likely to find a hit on Ancient Stirrings, and then got a bunch of greatest hits. Castle Garenberg, obviously very powerful. Can't cast everything, but allows you to cast Primeval Titan as kind of a soul land. And then obviously you have the various different lands to be able to trigger Field of the Dead. And then Grove of the Burn Willows is an underrated green source. This deck really deals damage in huge chunks, so I'm not worried about giving our opponents some life. And in the sideboard, you have access to things like Grafdigger's Cage, Weather the Storm, a little bit more flexibility than you would have out of Eldrazi Tron. Obviously, you don't have the card package, but this deck is very powerful with what's going on in this. And I thought it was an interesting kind of midway between the Amulet field lists that have been popping up and Eldrazi Tron, obviously being one of the top tier decks in the format. So another deck that I was interested in is this is a deck that popped up many moons ago when Hidden Herbalist was actually printed a couple years ago. This is kind of a 8 Burning Tree Emissary deck. One of the problems with Hidden Herbalist was always the fact that it triggers green, and a lot of your deck is red spells. So getting the mana requirements for Herbalist and Burning Tree Emissary in terms of getting them to their secondary free mana being can be difficult. This list is trying to go wide with a bunch of Goblin Guides, Hex Drinkers, Renegades, Wild Nacatls. You do have a small white splash. You don't actually have any white spells in the main deck, but just being able to get Nacatl up to a 3/3. This deck is kind of a lower to the ground Gruul deck that tries to exploit Goblin Bushwhacker and Reckless Bushwhacker. Used to be called 8-Whack. 8-Whack was definitely usually a Goblins deck, but this version also popped up as kind of Zoo-Whack, whatever you want to call it. And then you have access to some powerful white cards on the sideboard, like Path to Exile, Rest in Peace, and Thalia to kind of disrupt the more spell-based decks. This can disrupt the Oko decks and such, maybe not give you enough time to punish them. Also, Magus of the Moon, you are a Bears beatdown deck, for lack of a better term, but a little bit more power. And then Veil of Summer, because this card's just, it's everywhere. Sensory Hooligan can blow up an artifact when it comes into play. So, lots of powerful stuff going on here. A little bit different than how Burn and Prowess approach the matchups, but this deck tries to go wide and just kill your opponent in one swing. Very powerful deck. A little bit inconsistent, but very powerful cards when you can play cards like Atarka's Command, Reckless Bushwhacker, and Goblin Bushwhacker, giving your stuff haste and swinging in for a ton of damage. One more deck I'd like to go over, and that is a As Foretold deck. We have one last deck that I want to go over. It's an As Foretold blue-red controlish deck. This deck is all based around the card As Foretold, and I believe it also has 4 copies of Electric Dominance. So when As Foretold was first printed, this was a card that could struggle to the namesake decks could struggle to cast their free spells, because if you didn't draw one of your 4 As Foretold, you run a lot of trouble. But cards like Electro Dominance gives you the ability to also cast those very same spells. So this deck has 12 cards to go with that package. You have 4 Ancestral Visions for a lot of card advantage. 4 Crashing Footfalls because, 2/4/4 Rhinos on turn 2 or 3 is pretty nice. And then 4 copies of Restore Balance, which can be pretty good, especially when you pair it with Greater Gargadon, sacking your board away as the Restore Balance. Before the Restore Balance resolves, your opponent's basically left with nothing. They have no cards in hand, etc. if you're able to empty your hand out. So, very interesting deck. And then Simian Spirit Guide to kind of power it up so you can easily do this even on turn 1, Electro Dominance, or turn 2 with the Restore Balance. Like a turn 1, Suspend Greater Gargadon, turn 2, Simian Spirit Guide out, Electro Dominance into Restore Balance. Seems like it could be a rather vicious combo. And then, things like Ops, Serum Visions kind of hold the deck together, and then Lightning Bolt and Braid, as well as Is a Charm, as some early interaction. Finale of Promise, obviously not as great because you have to get them into the graveyard first, but being able to flash back one of these seems very powerful, and you do have a few instances in your deck you can also flash back at the same time. So, very powerful. On the sideboard, you get to play things like Blood Moon, Mystical Dispute, Leyline of Sanctity, because this is very much a combo-based deck. And if your opponent has any style of just hand disruption, this kind of strategy can easily fall apart. It does have problems finding its one of 8 combo pieces, not unlike a deck like a Nauseam. And then you have some more controlling things like Fry for the Okos. Anger of the Gods is another suitor sweeper against the faster decks. Shattering Spree can be pretty brutal when most of your land base here has access to red mana. Pithing will shut down Oko and other planeswalkers. And a couple of Mystical Disputes to have a little bit of light counter magic to go with your Is it Charms. The deck is definitely more predicated on speed than protecting things with counter magic. So you can understand the light counter spell package, but certainly can be problematic against control decks and Urza Oko if they're able to get their counter spells set up. So this is a very interesting thing overall. I think the one takeaway is from the 2 weeks is Urza Oko and Eldrazi Tron continue to be the most consistent performers. Burn continues to show up in these events. Now, keeping in mind, these are 3-2 records, so that means basically they're winning 60% of their matches. As we've seen in the Burn leagues that I've been doing on the channel, Burn can pretty consistently 3-2, and there have been different variants, but the majority of them have been the mono red variant, which I've played this week. It should be actually up today before this video goes up. But mono red Burn's been performing fairly well. The theory of it is you get underneath the Oko decks, but I'm not even sure that's necessarily true. So I'm not really sure. Like outside of the red-blue version that Burke played, I'm not really sure that there's any Burn deck that I've been truly excited about in this meta. The Urza or the Oko Burn deck was fun. Beyond that, obviously Urza Oko, Urza Artifacts, Simic Artifacts, whatever you want to call it. Very powerful deck. There's several different variants, but the primary one being the blue-green version with the counter spells. There's the Thopter Sword variant. There's the Karn variant that eschews any type of counter magic and such for access to liquid metal coating, and Ancient Grudge is kind of a meme thing, but can be very powerful if you get that combo online. And obviously the Titan Field decks continue to pop up. Those are kind of a variant of Amulet Titan / Valakut in one deck, only they're using Field of the Dead as their payoff rather than Valakut itself. Gives them a little bit more flexibility and able to play cards like Oko and such in their deck. Some variants playing the Reliquary and things. And then, underneath the surface, the rest of Modern continues to kind of move along. There's some Stoneforge decks, there's some Graveyard decks, there's a couple combo decks here and there. Even a Ponza deck popping up. So the format looks like it's in a good place, other than that top end with Urza Oko. So that said, I'm going to wrap this up, and don't forget to check out last week's summary if you want to take a look at some decks that popped up last week in the preliminaries.